The manifest for Doc 7 ran to 11 pages. I'd been on compact anti-trafficking details for 3 years by the time we pulled the Korath assignment, and I had learned to read manifests the way a medic reads a chart, not looking for what was there, but for what was missing. Most inspectors started at the top and worked down. I started at the name column and worked across. Korath Transit Hub was one of those stations that existed in the space between jurisdictions. Compact adjacent, the reports called it, which was a polite way of saying that anything licensed by the syndicate could sit on those docks for 30 days before compact authority could formally intervene. Breck Osal knew that. He had been running licensed cargo contracts out of Korath for 6 years, and his ledger was clean in the way that only deliberate effort can produce. Our detail had 3 inspectors, a compact trade liaison named Soar, and me. Soar was good at the trade codes. The other 2 inspectors knew the processing sequence. I knew how to read a blank field. Dock 7 smelled of coolant and old metal, the particular smell of a station that recycled its atmosphere 1 filter change too late. The overhead lighting was industrial, flat white, no shadows, and it turned everything the color of a document that had been photocopied too many times. There were 8 cage rows. Each row held 6 staging enclosures. Standard livestock transfer configuration, which was what the syndicate called it in the paperwork, and which was what the compact trade codes called it too, because no one had yet passed the amendment that changed the language. I walked the rows. Most of the cages held equipment, sealed crates, bundled wire, the kind of freight that ends up on a waystation dock because someone miscalculated a shipping route. 4 cages held sentient occupants. I noted each one in my log. 3 of the 4 met my eyes when I stopped. The 4th was in the end cage of row 6, and she didn't look at me at first. She was sitting against the rear wall with her knees drawn up, wrists linked by a short chain to a floor ring, and she was looking at a point on the floor 3 meters ahead of her, with the specific stillness of someone who had learned that attention from guards was not a good thing. I stopped anyway. She was Sothari, or close to it. I'd seen the skin tone in a trade registry briefing, that pale steel blue that shifted toward gray in flat light, and the dark auburn hair, though hers had been cut unevenly on one side, recently and not carefully. Her eyes, when she finally looked up, were a deep amber with no visible iris separation, the whole iris one solid wash of color, which meant she could see into frequency ranges I couldn't. She used those eyes to take a full inventory of me in about 2 seconds, my rank tabs, the compact emblem on my vest, the bolt cutters clipped to my kit bag, the fact that I was holding a manifest instead of a control rod, and then she looked back at the floor, not flinching, not afraid, just deciding I wasn't worth the energy yet. I looked at her manifest entry. LOT 774. Species classification. Sothari adjacent, sub-registry. Physical condition. Ambulatory. Non-combative. Licensing status. Syndicate standard transfer contract. Valid for 30 days from date of dock processing. Name field. Blank. I looked at the blank for a long moment. Then I took out my stylus and wrote, in my log, under the lot number, name field, empty. Compact Trade Code Section 7.4 requires registered personal identity for all sentient classified transfer contracts. Field is mandatory. Blank constitutes contract irregularity. I heard Breck Osal's footsteps before I heard his voice. He was a large man who moved with the particular confidence of someone who has had the same argument many times and won it. That's a licensed contract inspector. I can see that. The lot classification is compliant. You'll find the species sub-registry certification on page 9. I found it. I didn't look up from my log. The species classification is filed. The name field isn't. There was a pause. Sothari adjacent sub-registrants don't require personal identity entries under the syndicate standard form. They do under compact code. I turned to page 2 of his own ledger and showed him the clause. Paragraph 7.4 applies to any sentient classified transfer regardless of the origin registry. Your form is syndicate issued. My authority is compact. The compact clause controls. He looked at the clause for several seconds longer than a man looks at something he doesn't recognize. I can have the identity entered retroactively. You can't. Paragraph 7.4 requires the field to be populated at point of contract origination. Retroactive entry constitutes a falsified record under compact enforcement protocol. I closed my log. The contract is void. Osal's voice dropped in register, which is what happens when men who negotiate from volume discover it isn't working. You're going to make a problem out of a blank field. I'm going to make a record out of a blank field. I looked at him then, steadily, the way I'd learned to look at men who wanted me to feel like I was making a mistake. The record is already made. The contract voids on my certification. I'll need the cage key. He gave it to me after a moment. Not because he was a reasonable man, but because he had a very good sense of when a line had been crossed into territory that couldn't be walked back from. I went back to row 6, cage end. She was watching me when I returned. Not the inventory look she'd given me the first time, something more direct than that. She'd heard enough of it to know what had happened, or at least the shape of what had happened, and she was deciding what to do with it. I unlocked the cage door and left it open. Then I crouched down in front of the floor ring and looked at the chain connecting her wrists to it. "I'm going to cut this," I said. "You don't have to do anything." She said nothing. I cut it. The bolt cutters made a clean sound, and the chain dropped. She sat still for a moment with her freed wrists in her lap, looking at the chain ends, and I straightened up and stepped back from the cage door to give her room. She stood on her own. She didn't need a hand up, didn't look for one. She walked out of the cage the way I imagined she had walked into it. Upright, unhurried, the kind of bearing that doesn't come from training but from a deeper certainty about what you are, even when everything around you is trying to convince you otherwise. She walked past me into the corridor. I followed at a distance. Soar met us at the processing threshold with the compact violation forms already printing. He handed me my copies without speaking, because Soar was professional and understood that paperwork was the thing that made moments like this stick. I signed the top copy and kept the carbon. I became aware that she had stopped walking. She was standing at the edge of the threshold where the dock corridor opened into the main transit arm, and she was looking at the far end of the corridor, at the departure gates, at the space beyond them, at the general direction of a way. Her hands were at her sides. The wrist marks from the chain were visible from where I stood, a shallow bruising on pale steel blue skin. She turned and looked at me. I was holding my inspection log. I had the violation notation already filed. The one thing I hadn't filled in was the identity line at the top of the lot entry, because I still didn't have a name to put there, and I wasn't going to invent one. She looked at the log, and then at me, and then at the log again. She seemed to be deciding something. It wasn't fear. It was the particular deliberateness of a person who has learned not to give their name to people who will use it as a tracking number, and who now had to decide whether this was different. She said, Naiva Velsothari. Her voice was lower than I expected, and steadier. I wrote it in, full name, both parts, the way it was meant to be recorded. I wrote it carefully, in the identity field at the top of the page, above the lot number, above the contract void notation, because that was the right order of things. The person first, the paperwork second. When I looked up, she was already walking, not toward the departure gates, not yet, toward the Transit Hub service office, which was where the compact detainee support liaison maintained an office, because she had been on that dock long enough to know where things were, and she was not the kind of person who waited to be told. I made a note of her direction in the log. Then I closed the log and went back to finish Doc 7. There were 10 pages of manifest left, and I still had the name column to read.